Some stories feel like they were written for the silver screen. They have romance, tragedy, glamour, and a touch of scandal. They feature a beautiful, ambitious young woman who defies convention, marries the most powerful man in the country, and completely changes the world she inhabits. This isn't a Hollywood script, it's the real-life story of Julia Gardiner Tyler, one of America's most forgotten yet most revolutionary first ladies. She entered the White House as a vibrant 24-year-old, 30 years younger than the president she secretly married. In just 8 months, she would redefine the role of the president's wife, creating an almost royal court in the heart of a democratic republic. But behind the dazzling parties and the political triumphs lies a much more complex and, for many, a deeply controversial story. Today we're going to uncover the dramatic and often shocking life of the woman they called the Rose of Long Island. To understand Julia, we have to step back into the America of the 1840s. This was the antebellum era, a period of immense growth and simmering violent tension. It was a world lit by gas lamps and powered by steam, where fortunes were being made in burgeoning cities like New York. But it was also a nation deeply irrevocably divided by the institution of slavery. The Mason-Dixon line wasn't just a geographical border. It was a profound cultural and moral chasm. Socially, it was a time of strict, almost suffocating rules for women, especially those in the upper classes. A woman's life was expected to follow a predictable path: a good marriage, the management of a household, and the raising of children. Public life, politics, and ambition were the exclusive domain of men. For a young woman to have her own opinions, let alone to actively seek out the spotlight and wield influence, was considered unseemly, even scandalous. This was the rigid, patriarchal world that Julia Gardiner was born into, and a world whose rules she seemed destined to break. Julia Gardiner was born in 1820 on Gardiner's Island, a private island off the coast of Long Island, New York, that had been in her family for generations. The Gardiners were old money, a wealthy and socially prominent family, and Julia was raised in a world of privilege and luxury. From a young age, she was known for her striking beauty, her vivacious personality, and a headstrong, ambitious nature that often chafed against the constraints of her time. She was educated at the finest finishing schools, where she learned French, music, and the social graces expected of a young lady of her station. But Julia had a taste for something more than just a quiet, domestic life. Her first brush with public notoriety and a hint of the scandal that would later follow her came when she was just 19 years old. In an act that was utterly shocking for a young woman of her social standing, she secretly posed for a newspaper advertisement for a middle-class department store called Boggs and Muir. In the ad, she was depicted strolling with her father under the headline, "The Rose of Long Island," and the accompanying text praised her exquisite taste. When her family discovered what she had done, they were horrified. For a high society debutante to engage in such a commercial and frankly common enterprise was a major scandal. To save face, her parents whisked her away on a grand tour of Europe, hoping the controversy would die down. But the incident was telling. It revealed a young woman who was not only aware of her own beauty and influence, but was also willing to use it in unconventional ways. She enjoyed the attention, she craved the spotlight. The grand tour of Europe further polished her, exposing her to the royal courts and aristocratic societies of London, Paris, and Rome. This experience would have a profound impact on her, shaping the vision she would later bring to the White House. When the Gardiners returned to the United States in late 1842, Julia was no longer just a scandalous debutante. She was a sophisticated, worldly woman and one of the most celebrated beauties in the country. Her family began spending the social season in Washington, D.C., And it was here that her path would cross with that of the President of the United States, John Tyler. John Tyler, a widower in his early 50s, was immediately captivated by the vibrant 23-year-old Julia. He began to court her, but she initially rebuffed his advances. He was, after all, 30 years her senior, a man older than her own father. But Tyler was persistent. And then a horrific tragedy occurred that would irrevocably bind their fates together. On February 28, 1844, Julia, her father David Gardiner, and a host of other Washington dignitaries were invited for a pleasure cruise down the Potomac River aboard the new steam frigate, the USS Princeton. The highlight of the event was to be the firing of a massive new naval cannon, nicknamed the Peacemaker. During one of its final firings, the cannon malfunctioned and exploded, sending shrapnel tearing across the deck. The blast instantly killed several people, including the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Navy, and Julia's beloved father, David Gardiner. In the chaos and horror of the aftermath, President Tyler, who had been below deck, rushed to Julia's side. He found her in a state of shock and grief, having just witnessed her father's violent death. He carried her off the boat and comforted her. In that shared moment of tragedy and trauma, something shifted between them. His gentle strength and compassionate care touched her deeply. Her earlier reservations about their age difference seemed to melt away in the face of his kindness. A few months later, she accepted his proposal of marriage, fearing a public backlash due to their 30-year age gap and the fact that the president was still officially in mourning for his first wife. They planned their wedding in absolute secrecy. On June 26, 1844, Julia Gardiner, age 24, married President John Tyler, age 54, in a small private ceremony in a New York City church. The nation woke up the next morning to the shocking news that they had a new and very young First Lady. Julia's arrival in the White House was like a whirlwind of champagne, music, and glamour. The executive mansion, which had been a somber place under the care of Tyler's quiet, semi-invalid first wife, Letitia, and then his daughter-in-law, was completely transformed. Julia, with her European sensibilities and love of spectacle, was determined to create a sea White House that rivaled the royal courts she had admired abroad. She saw herself not just as the president's wife, but as a queen of the American Republic, and she began to act the part. She made grand entrances at balls, preceded by a white-gloved honor guard. She would receive guests while seated on a raised platform in a plush armchair, like a throne, surrounded by a coterie of 12 maids of honor, all dressed in white. She wore a distinctive queenly headdress with long flowing white ribbons. She even hired her own press agent, a journalist named F.W. Thomas, to ensure that her social triumphs were breathlessly reported in the newspapers. This was a radical departure from the modest Republican style of her predecessors. She also introduced new customs, like having the Marine Band play Hail to the Chief whenever the president appeared at official functions, a tradition that continues to this day. And she was a master of political theater. She loved to waltz, a dance still considered slightly scandalous by some, and she would often dance with foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries, using her charm as a tool of soft diplomacy. One of the most humanizing, yet often overlooked aspects of Julia's story is her relationship with her new, very large family. When she married John Tyler, she didn't just become a wife, she became the stepmother to his 7 surviving children, some of whom were older than she was. This was an incredibly delicate and potentially fraught situation. The Tyler children had recently lost their mother and were now faced with a stepmother their own age, a glamorous New York socialite who was a world away from their quiet Virginian mother. The potential for resentment and conflict was enormous. Yet by most accounts, Julia handled the situation with remarkable grace and sensitivity. She made a conscious effort not to overstep or to try and replace their mother. Instead, she sought to be a friend and a companion, especially to the younger Tyler children. Alice Tyler, who was just a few years younger than Julia, became one of her closest confidants and a staunch defender against public criticism. She was one of Julia's 12 maids of honor and stood by her side at all the grand White House functions. This close bond speaks volumes about Julia's emotional intelligence. She understood that she was entering a family still in the throes of grief, and she navigated that complex emotional landscape with a deftness that belied her years. Her personal correspondence reveals a woman who was deeply in love with her much older husband. She referred to him as the President, even in her private letters, a sign of her immense respect for his office and for him as a man. He in turn doted on her, calling her his darling July. Theirs was, by all accounts, a genuine and passionate love affair. He was rejuvenated by her youthful energy, and she was drawn to his power, intelligence, and the stability he offered after the trauma of her father's death. A particularly telling anecdote comes from one of their first trips together after their marriage. The presidential steamship they were traveling on experienced a minor accident, and for a few moments there was panic on board. Julia, who was still deeply traumatized by the USS Princeton disaster, was terrified. John Tyler, seeing her distress, calmly took her in his arms and reportedly said, "My dear, nothing can harm you when you are with me." This simple protective gesture encapsulates their dynamic. He was her protector, her anchor, and she was his fountain of youth, his beautiful rose. But of course, not everyone was enchanted by the new First Lady. Julia Tyler's tenure in the White House, though brief, was steeped in controversy. The secret nature of her wedding and the 30-year age gap between her and the president were, for many, a source of scandal and gossip. The public, and especially Tyler's political opponents, were quick to criticize. They painted her as a flighty, frivolous young woman, an ambitious social climber who had married an old man for his power and position. Her lavish parties and queenly pretensions were seen by many as deeply undemocratic and offensive to the Republican values of the nation. One particularly sharp-tongued critic, the former First Lady Louisa Adams, wrote scathingly in her diary about Julia's ostentatious display and her unbecoming desire for attention. Furthermore, Julia was an unapologetic and vocal supporter of the institution of slavery. As a wealthy New Yorker who married into the Virginia plantation elite, she fully embraced the pro-slavery ideology of her husband and his social class, defending it with the zeal of a convert. This was and remains the most significant moral stain on her legacy. In her writings and conversations, she echoed the paternalistic arguments of the Southern aristocracy, insisting that enslaved people were like children, incapable of caring for themselves and better off under the benevolent guidance of their masters. She saw slavery not as a brutal system of forced labor and human trafficking, but as a natural, divinely ordained order that ensured social stability. This put her in stark opposition to the growing abolitionist movement in the North, a movement she viewed with contempt. Her glamorous White House events, filled with music and champagne, were, in essence, funded by the labor of the dozens of enslaved people on the Tyler family's Virginia plantation, Sherwood Forest. While Julia was celebrated in the press as the Rose of Long Island, the men, women, and children whose forced labor paid for her gowns and parties remained invisible, their own lives defined by hardship and the constant threat of violence. This is a profound and uncomfortable contradiction. The woman who was so modern in her creation of a public persona was, at the same time, a staunch defender of an archaic and brutal institution. Her political influence, while unofficial, was also a source of debate. Julia was not content to be a passive observer content with planning menus. She took a keen interest in politics, and her husband, 30 years her senior, valued her opinions and her sharp social instincts. Her most significant political triumph came in the final days of Tyler's presidency. The annexation of Texas was his most cherished political goal, the capstone he desperately wanted for his controversial administration. But the treaty had been struggling to pass through a deeply divided Congress. Julia threw herself into the cause with the fervor of a seasoned political operative. She transformed her glittering White House balls into arenas for high-stakes lobbying. One can easily imagine the scene. Julia, dazzling in a Parisian gown, singling out a wavering congressman, perhaps a man from a northern state feeling pressure from his abolitionist constituents. She would take his arm, steer him away from the crowd, and with her famous disarming charm, make a passionate case for annexation, framing it as a matter of national destiny and patriotic duty. When the resolution finally passed just 3 days before the end of Tyler's term, she was ecstatic. At her grand farewell ball, a massive event she dubbed the Birth of Texas Ball, she triumphantly held up the pen used to sign the bill and declared that the pen of history had been written. Some praised her for her patriotic zeal and political savvy. Others, however, condemned her for what they saw as an improper and unladylike intrusion into the world of politics, using her feminine wiles to manipulate the nation's legislature. The historical debate continues. Was she a pioneering political partner or a socialite who overstepped her bounds? The consequences of Julia Tyler's brief 8-month tenure as First Lady were far-reaching and surprisingly profound. She completely revolutionized the role. Before Julia, the First Lady was largely a private figure, a background hostess. Julia dragged the position into the national spotlight, making it a role of public interest, celebrity, and influence. She was arguably the first presidential wife to understand the power of public relations, going so far as to hire her own press agent to ensure her activities received favorable coverage. Her grand, almost royal style set a new standard for White House entertaining, a standard that many later First Ladies, like Jacqueline Kennedy with her Camelot, would echo. By embracing her public role with such gusto, she created a new expectation that the First Lady was not just the president's wife, but a national figure in her own right. Her political impact, however, is far more complex. Her passionate advocacy for the annexation of Texas certainly helped to push the controversial measure over the finish line. This act had enormous consequences, almost immediately leading to the Mexican-American War and adding a vast new slave territory to the United States. This acquisition of land dramatically escalated the sectional tensions that were already tearing the country apart, making the eventual collision of the Civil War all the more inevitable. In this sense, her greatest political triumph was also a catalyst for national tragedy. After leaving the White House in 1845, Julia and John Tyler retired to his Sherwood Forest plantation in Virginia. There, she fully embraced the life of a plantation mistress. Managing the large household staff of enslaved people, she gave birth to 7 children, raising a large family in the Southern tradition she had come to love. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, there was no question where her loyalties lay. She was a fervent supporter of the Confederacy, viewing the Union as an aggressor and the Southern cause as a noble fight for independence. John Tyler was even elected to the Confederate Congress, but he died in 1862 before he could take his seat, making him the only U.S. president in history to die having sworn allegiance to an enemy nation. Julia, now a widow in her early 40s, found her home, Sherwood Forest, caught directly in the path of the war. Union troops occupied the plantation, and she was forced to flee. After the Confederacy's defeat, she faced financial ruin, her entire way of life and the source of her wealth utterly destroyed. In a final fascinating chapter of her life, and in a moment of profound historical irony, this proud Confederate supporter moved back north and spent years lobbying the very U.S. government she had renounced. Displaying the same political tenacity she had shown with the Texas issue, she successfully petitioned Congress for a presidential widow's pension, arguing her case with congressmen and eventually winning her claim in 1880. It was a remarkable final act for a woman whose life was a tapestry of glamour, ambition, and profound contradiction. In the end, what can we learn from the dazzling and difficult life of Julia Gardiner Tyler? Her story is a vivid illustration of the power of personality to shape history. She shows us that even within the most rigid social constraints, an ambitious and intelligent woman could carve out a sphere of influence. She was a pioneer in creating the modern public role of the First Lady, a role that combines social grace with political importance. But her story is also a cautionary tale. It's a stark reminder that glamour and charisma can exist alongside deeply troubling moral convictions. Julia's life forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of our own history, to acknowledge that the beautiful, elegant world of the antebellum elite was built on the back of human bondage. We cannot separate the glamorous First Lady from the staunch defender of slavery. To understand Julia Tyler is to understand the profound contradictions that lay at the heart of 19th century America. Why does she still matter? She matters because she was a disruptor, a woman who broke the mold and forever changed our expectations of the women in the White House. And she matters because her story, in all its glamour and all its ugliness, holds up a mirror to a vital and deeply conflicted period of the American past. Julia Tyler was a woman of incredible energy, ambition, and charm. She lived a life of dramatic highs and profound historical consequence. She was the young bride who captivated a president and a nation. She was the queen of a democratic court who reveled in the power and the spectacle. But she was also a woman of her time and class, a defender of a system that we now rightly condemn. Her legacy is not a simple one. It is a complex tapestry woven with threads of both light and shadow. To remember her is not just to recall the dazzling parties and the secret romance, but to grapple with the difficult, uncomfortable truths of the nation's history, a history that she both graced and, in some ways, darkened.